For years, people have said that VR just isn't practical for flight simulators, that you can't properly spot enemies, that the image looks blurry, and that it ends up being more of a gimmick than a real advantage. And honestly, for a long time I believed that too. But after flying in VR for over 2 years and more recently stepping into a high-end headset, my perspective has completely changed. The moment I put it on, I felt like going from being half blind to actually seeing the battlefield clearly. For the first time, I could read cockpit instruments without zooming, track enemy aircraft naturally just by moving my head, and actually feel like I was inside the aircraft instead of controlling it from the outside. Now that doesn't mean VR is perfect. It comes with real trade-offs and limitations in terms of performance, comfort, and depending on the headset, the experience can vary quite a bit. And that's exactly why I wanted to make this video. Today I'm going to break down the real pros and cons of using VR in flight simulators, what actually changes when you switch from a flat screen, and whether it is truly worth it. Because once you understand what VR does to the way you fly, there's a very good chance you won't want to go back. Welcome back, gentlemen, Brigadier Fox here. Stay with me because today I am going to show you exactly how VR changes the way you fly. There's simply no real way to fully explain what it feels like to go from flying on a flat screen to using a VR headset. You go from sitting at your desk to being inside the cockpit. You go from being an observer to actually being part of the experience. Nothing prepares you for that moment when you start looking around and exploring the aircraft in full detail. The switches, the instruments, the levers, everything around you. And just when you think you've seen enough, you climb up to 5,000 or 6,000 meters just to look out over the landscape, and suddenly you're not just looking at it, but it feels like you are actually up there. And that's the first major change VR introduces. It places you fully inside the world, visually and spatially, in a way a flat screen simply cannot replicate. You have probably seen it in many videos, maybe even on my videos, but no footage really comes close to experiencing it for yourself. It's honestly something I think everyone should try at least once. And once you get past that initial moment of just looking around like a kid, the next major change VR hits you with is something much more important: real situational awareness experience in first person. Situational awareness is your ability to understand what's happening around you in space. This means where you are, where others are, and how everything is moving in relation to you. On a flat screen, you can only approximate that using camera controls or head tracking, but it never feels truly natural. The moment you put on a VR headset, this changes completely. You gain something incredibly powerful: natural head movement. You don't think about controls anymore, you just look around and your brain processes the environment in full 3D. Because of that, you develop real spatial awareness, something that simply is not possible on a flat screen. At the same time, that mental input delay disappears. You are no longer thinking about how to move your view, you're just reacting and looking around. And if you're used to something like track IR, the difference is just as noticeable. There are no curves, no snapping, no artificial feeling of controlling your vision. If your wingman is to your right, you just know it, and when you turn your head, he's exactly where you expect him to be. Your instruments are where they should be, and your brain starts to treat everything as if it physically exists around you. And this translates directly into combat, because in a dogfight with a bit of practice, your brain begins to understand the position and trajectory of enemy aircraft in real time. So tracking enemies becomes far more intuitive, maintaining visual contact becomes easier, and even when you lose sight of an enemy, your brain often feels where they should be based on the last movement. And once you get used to tracking targets naturally, something magical happens, because you don't just know where the enemies are anymore, you begin to understand the space between you. On a flat screen, distance is something you constantly have to estimate, relying on experience, visual cues, and a fair amount of guesswork. But in VR, that sense of distance becomes much more intuitive, and you start to feel how far the enemy is, how fast you are closing in, and how your movement affects that relationship in real time. This has a direct impact in a dogfight, because for the first time, managing closure becomes something natural rather than something you have to consciously calculate. You can sense if you're coming in too fast, if you're about to overshoot, or if you need to adjust your turn to stay behind your target, which means you are no longer reacting late but anticipating what's about to happen. As a result, the geometry of the fight starts to make sense in a much more intuitive and natural way, and you naturally understand whether you're gaining angles, losing angles, or how your position is evolving moment to moment. So instead of processing everything step by step, your brain treats it as a continuous spatial experience. This clarity translates into confidence, and your flying becomes smoother and more deliberate with fewer abrupt corrections because you're no longer guessing, you're responding to what you actually perceive. And while this becomes incredibly powerful in combat, it also carries over to everything else you do in the aircraft, because landing starts to feel much more natural as you can judge your height and descent with far greater precision. And the same applies to takeoffs, low altitude flying, and any kind of precise maneuvering close to the ground, where instead of estimating distances, you're actually perceiving them in a way that feels much closer to real life. And once you adapt to this, going back to a flat screen starts to feel like losing an entire layer of spatial understanding. For years, spotting has been one of the biggest weaknesses of VR in flight simulators, and one of the main reasons why many people either avoided it or tried it once and went back to a flat screen. And to be completely honest, that concern is not wrong. After spending a long time flying with the Meta Quest 2, I can tell you that spotting can absolutely be a problem depending on your setup. The issue is not that you can't see things in the distance, it is that you often cannot clearly identify them. At medium ranges, an aircraft can turn into a distorted pixel, a small dark shape that doesn't give you enough information, so you might see something there but you don't know what it is, and that uncertainty directly affects how you fight. Now, there are ways to actually improve this. You can increase render resolution, which means asking your system to draw the image with more detail, and you can apply sharpening filters either in-game or through your graphic settings, and those adjustments do actually help as the image becomes clearer and spotting improves. But in my experience, they don't fully solve the problem, because spotting is not just about size or sharpness, it is more about clarity and detail density, and that's where newer, higher-end headsets start to make a real difference. Recently, I had the opportunity to try the Pimax Crystal Super headset, which was provided to me by the good people at Pimax so I could test it out and share my honest opinion. And the difference compared to what I was used to with the Meta Quest 2 was immediately noticeable. The higher resolution and pixel density allows you to identify aircraft much earlier instead of just guessing what you're looking at, because you start to pick up outlines, movement, shapes, and subtle details at ranges where before you were still trying to figure out if anything was there at all. And that has a direct impact on combat, because seeing the enemy earlier gives you more time to react, more time to position, and more control over the engagement. It doesn't make the game easier, and it's not perfect either, but it removes one of the biggest limitations VR used to have for years and turns it into something that actually works in your favor. Now, I am still putting more time into the Crystal Super, and there's a lot more I want to say about it, so if you would like to see a full review with a deeper breakdown, please let me know in the comments down below. Another area where VR completely changes the experience is how you interact with the aircraft itself. On a flat screen, the cockpit is something you look at, but in VR it becomes something you are inside of, and that shift is more important than it might seem, because it changes the way you relate to the airplane and how you interact with it, because you kind of start to feel it. But let me explain. Instead of relying purely on numbers and indicators, you begin to pick up on subtle cues, the way the aircraft moves, how it responds to your input, even small visual vibrations that hint at what's about to happen. When you're pushing the aircraft to its limits in a sustained turn, those cues become much clearer, and you can sense when you're getting close to a stall without constantly checking an indicator. You're no longer just reading data, you are now interpreting your aircraft's behaviors. But for me, one of the biggest changes comes from something much simpler. You now have a real cockpit in front of you. All your instruments are right there, exactly where they should be. Airspeed, altitude, fuel, engine parameters, everything is available with a quick glance or even through your peripheral vision. And because of that, the need for a virtual HUD or heads-up display starts to disappear. At first, it's normal to keep using it just like on a flat screen, but over time you realize you don't actually need it anymore, and you can turn it off completely and rely on the cockpit itself, which makes the experience not only more immersive but also cleaner and more natural. And that's something that's very difficult to replicate on a flat screen, because reading instruments usually requires moving your camera, zooming in, or taking your attention away from what's happening outside, while in VR everything exists in the same space and accessing that information becomes almost effortless, like you will do in a real airplane. Alright, so now, as incredible as all of this feels, there's a reality behind VR that we need to talk about, because all of these advantages don't come for free. Let's say you have a PC that runs flight simulators perfectly on a 1080p monitor. You can play DCS, IL-2, Warthunder, and maybe even Microsoft Flight Simulator if you are lucky, at high frame rates, everything feels smooth, and your GPU is just cruising. Now you plug in a VR headset. With something like a Meta Quest 2 or Quest 3, you're no longer rendering a single 1080p image, it's closer to rendering two higher resolution images at the same time, one for each eye, each roughly in the 2K range. So instead of driving one screen, your system suddenly has to handle a much heavier workload, and that's where things start to change. That same PC that felt powerful on a flat screen can struggle a lot in VR, especially in more demanding scenarios unless you start lowering graphics settings or adjusting your configuration. And this scales even further with high-end headsets. With something like the Pimax Crystal Super, you're getting closer to rendering two near 4K images simultaneously at high frame rates in freaking real time, and that's where your GPU really starts to sweat a little. So naturally, if you want to run VR smoothly, especially at higher settings, you will need hardware that can keep up. But don't worry, it sounds more intimidating than it actually is. There are simple ways to optimize your setup and make VR work even on more modded systems, and we will get into that in just a moment. But beyond performance, there's another side of VR that you don't really understand until you try it, and that's the physical side of the experience. The adaptation phase is real. The first time you put on a headset, your brain almost rejects it, as having something strapped to your face really feels unnatural. But in my experience, within 1 or 2 days, that feeling completely disappears and your brain just adapts. After that, comfort becomes the main factor, and it mostly comes down to weight and how the headset sits on your head. Some headsets like the Meta Quest 2 or Meta Quest 3 are known for having uncomfortable default straps, which is why many users switch to third-party options. That said, lighter headsets are always easier to tolerate because less weight means less pressure. This becomes more noticeable with higher-end headsets like the Pimax Crystal, which are heavier. However, they also come with better straps and padding, and in my experience that balances things out quite well. Still, with current technology, you will always feel that you have something on your head. And that directly affects session length. Because VR is more physical, long sessions become more demanding. After 2 or 3 hours, fatigue starts to build up, not just from the weight, but for constantly moving your head, scanning the sky, or checking your SIGs. For 1 or 2 hour sessions, this is perfectly fine, but beyond that, especially for longer recording sessions, it can get pretty tiring. As for eye strain, it hasn't been a major issue for me. After 2 years, I haven't suddenly gone blind or anything crazy like that. You might feel some fatigue after long sessions, especially in a dark room, but overall it is still manageable. And finally, some people do mention heat. Personally, I haven't really experienced something like this, but it likely depends on the person and the environment. If you are playing in the summer, a ventilated room or air conditioning will pretty much solve it. Another thing to keep in mind is that VR is not always completely plug and play. Unlike a flat screen setup, in VR you usually need to spend a bit of time fine-tuning your settings to get the best experience. The two main things you will adjust are render resolution and refresh rate. Render resolution controls how sharp the image looks, while refresh rate, either 72, 90 or 120 Hz, determines how many frames per second your headset expects. So if you set your headset to 90 Hz, your PC needs to consistently deliver around 90 FPS to keep things smooth. If it can't deliver 90 FPS, that's when you get stuttering and frame drops. So what you end up doing is balancing graphic settings and resolution until you find that sweet spot between clarity and performance. But once you find the perfect setting, you're pretty much set and you don't have to keep tweaking it every time you play. And finally, another important thing to understand is that not all VR headsets are the same, and this is where a lot of confusion comes from. In general terms, there are two main types of VR headsets. On one side, you have standalone headsets like the Meta Quest, which work as self-contained systems, almost like a console you wear on your head. They are more accessible and great for casual users. On the other side, you have dedicated PC VR headsets like the Pimax lineup, which are built specifically to run from a powerful PC and focus on delivering the best possible visual quality and performance. The key difference is that standalone headsets are not primarily designed for PC VR. They can be adapted to it, but that adds an extra layer of complexity which can lead to more setup friction or occasional connection issues. In contrast, dedicated PC VR headsets are designed to work directly with your PC from the ground up, which makes them a much more natural fit for simulation environments. Especially for flight sims where you usually have a fixed setup, they tend to offer a more stable and consistent experience. Alright, so at this point you probably already have a pretty good idea of what VR brings to flight simulation, but you might also have a few questions in mind, things like whether it actually makes you a better pilot, if it is viable for competitive flying, or how demanding it really is in practice. So before wrapping things up, I want to take a moment to go through some of the most common questions people usually have when they are considering making the switch from flat screens to VR, and give you clear, honest answers based on my own experience. Does VR makes you better? The answer is no, VR doesn't automatically make you better, and it doesn't make you worse either. What it really does is amplify what you already are. It gives you the potential to learn faster, but it still depends entirely on how you use it. I have seen many VR pilots who never fully take advantage of what the technology offers and keeps flying exactly the same way they did on a flat screen. And the reality is that VR gives you access to many of the same tools real pilots rely on, like true 3D vision, natural spatial awareness, and a direct connection with the aircraft through the cockpit, allowing you to understand maneuvers and positioning in a way that simply is not possible on a flat screen. But having access to those tools doesn't automatically make you better. Getting into a real aircraft doesn't magically turn someone into a great pilot, and VR works the same way. It doesn't improve your skill on its own, it gives you the environment and the tools to become the best version of yourself if you choose to use them. Does VR hurt competitive flying? I have seen a lot of people criticize VR players, even claiming they have an unfair advantage, but in my experience that couldn't be further from the truth. VR gives you massive advantages in awareness, tracking, and spatial understanding, but at the same time it introduces a completely new set of limitations. It becomes a balance almost in a philosophical way. On one hand, your ability to track targets and understand positioning improves dramatically. On the other hand, VR makes the experience physical. You are no longer just sitting and playing, you are actively using your body, and that has a cost. On a flat screen, you can play for hours without fatigue. In VR, after a couple of hours, fatigue starts to build up, and over time your performance can drop simply because you are physically more tired, much closer to what real pilots experience. So in the end, competitive performance doesn't necessarily get better or worse, it just changes. It becomes a different kind of challenge. And if we are talking about raw numbers, in my honest experience, I was actually getting more kills per match back when I played on a flat screen. It wasn't unusual for me to get 15 or even 20 kills in a game, and now in VR, if I reach around 10 kills per match, I am more than happy with that result. Do you need a monster PC to play in VR? The short answer is no. A high-end system is ideal if you want to push everything to the maximum or create content like I do, but it's absolutely not required to have a smooth and enjoyable experience. Like we discussed earlier, you have two main tools to manage performance: your in-game graphics settings and your render resolution. It is completely normal to lower certain settings in VR, even on powerful GPUs, and adjusting render resolution allows you to balance clarity and performance depending on what your system can handle. For example, with headsets like the Quest 2 or Meta Quest 3, it is common to increase render resolution to improve clarity, while with higher-end headsets you can lower it slightly to maintain stable performance. And that's what many people do not realize. You don't need a top-tier GPU to run high-end headsets like the Pimax Crystal line. A stronger GPU always helps, but the key is understanding how to balance your settings. In the end, VR is much more flexible than it might seem. Who is VR for? VR can work for more people than you might think. It really depends on how you like to play. If you are a more casual player, someone who flies occasionally or dedicates time on weekends, VR can be a fantastic option. You usually have the time to fine-tune your setup and enjoy the experience without rushing. In that case, something like a Meta Quest 3 or even a Pimax Crystal Light can both make sense depending on the level of quality you are looking for. If you are a more dedicated sim pilot, especially if you fly regularly and care about realism, VR can be even more powerful, as long as you're using a headset that delivers enough clarity. That's where higher-end options like the Pimax Crystal Light or the Pimax Crystal Super do really shine. And yes, longer sessions can be more physically demanding, but in my experience that's something you get used to fairly quickly, and the overall experience more than makes up for it. So VR is not limited to one type of player, it adapts to you as long as you approach it with the right expectations. What VR headsets do I recommend? So if you're at the point when you're actually considering making the switch, a very natural question is which headsets should you choose? And the answer depends on what kind of experience you are looking for. Headsets like the Meta Quest 3 are often recommended as a solid entry point, and that's pretty fair because they are accessible and work pretty well for a lot of people. But speaking from my own experience, after using the Quest 2 for 2 years, I have to be honest, there was almost never a week where I did not run into some kind of issue, whether it was software updates, connection problems, A-Link not behaving the way it should, or whatever. It works, but it doesn't always feel as seamless as you might expect, because the Meta Quest 2 or the Meta Quest 3 are designed around the Meta ecosystem and they are not primarily designed as a PC VR headset. On the other hand, if your goal is to get the best possible experience specifically for flight simulation, then a dedicated PC VR headset like the Pimax Crystal Lite or the Pimax Crystal Super are, in my opinion, some of the strongest options available right now. They are designed around high-resolution PC VR from the ground up, and that really shows in clarity, spotting and overall immersion. And just to be completely transparent, as I mentioned earlier, Pimax did send me a Crystal Super to test and share my honest opinion without any influence on what should I say. After a couple of weeks, I can already say that the experience has been amazing so far, but I will go much deeper into that in a dedicated video very soon. And in case you were already considering getting a Pimax Crystal Super or a Pimax Crystal Lite, I will leave links and a discount code in the description so you can check that out. Alright, so after everything we have talked about, the immersion, the situational awareness, the depth perception, the way you interact with the aircraft, and even the trade-offs that come with it, it really comes down to a very simple question. Can I go back to flying on a flat screen? And the answer, at least for me, is something I realized the very first time I put on a VR headset. The moment I stepped into the cockpit for the first time with my good old Meta Quest 2, I knew there was no going back. It didn't matter if it was less comfortable, if performance was harder to manage, or if the setup required more effort. None of that outweighed what I was experiencing. Because at that point I wasn't looking at a simulation anymore and I was inside of it. There's just nothing that replaces the feeling of moving your head freely, of glancing at your instruments naturally, of seeing the world rotate around you as you roll the aircraft in a barrel roll, and truly feeling connected to what you are flying. And once you experience that, it is very hard to go back. So for me, there's simply no other way to fly. No flat screen, no matter how sharp, how smooth or how wide it is, can replace what VR brings to my experience. And that's why, at least for me, VR will always be the true and proper way to fly in flight simulators. That's gonna be all for today's video, folks. Thanks for watching. I'm Brigadier Fox. See you in the skies.